highly classified military documents online has been ordered to remain behind bars pending a hearing next week. 21-year-old Jack Teixeira appeared in Boston federal court a short time ago, one day after his arrest at his family's home in Massachusetts. Broward County, Florida, under a state of emergency as declared by Governor Ron DeSantis. The declaration comes in the aftermath of devastating flooding from a powerful storm. It dumped 20 inches of rain in a matter of just hours. A massive fire at an Indiana recycling plant has been put out.
The fire in Richmond started Tuesday afternoon and released huge plumes of toxic smoke. That led to an evacuation order for over 2,000 residents, and the order will continue. Richmond Mayor Dave Snow says air and water samples will be collected to determine when that evacuation order can be lifted. Tasha Stevens reporting.
Also at SRNnews.com, the National Rifle Association's annual convention starts today in Indianapolis.
The three-day gathering will include thousands of the NRA's most active members and is attracting some top Republican presidential candidates and those considering a run. Former President Donald Trump will be speaking, and his Secret Service protection means attendees cannot have guns at the convention. Former Vice President Mike Pence will be there, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is speaking through video conference. The NRA calls the convention one of the most politically significant and popular events in the country. I'm Donna Warder.
Another sign of the increasingly warm relationship between Moscow and Beijing, China's defense minister about to pay a visit to Russia. On Wall Street, the Dow down 147 points. The Nasdaq is off 62. This is SRN News. Franklin Graham is preparing for his next big event.
The popular evangelist is planning to bring the gospel to people in the Mid-Atlantic region this month with his God Loves You Tidewater Tour. The first stop is La Plata, Maryland on April 29th. Graham will also preach in Elkton, Salisbury, Baltimore, Portsmouth, Virginia, and Edenton, North Carolina through the first week of May. Each year he picks a region of the country to focus on. So far, 27,000 people have come to Christ. Michael Harrington, SRN News.
Walter Reed National Military Medical Center being criticized for a decision not to renew a contract for Catholic priests to provide pastoral care, hiring a secular firm instead. For 20 years, priests from the Holy Name College Friary in Silver Spring, Maryland, administered to service members and veterans hospitalized at Walter Reed. The developments have drawn the attention of several Republican members of Congress, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida among them. This is SRN News. The state of Missouri cracking down on doctors doing transgender operations or administering puberty blockers to minors.
Missouri minors will soon be required to go through 18 months of therapy before receiving any transgender health care. The state's Republican Attorney General announced a new emergency rule Thursday imposing those limits starting April 27th. The rule's release came on the same day the Missouri House voted to ban any transgender-related health care for minors. The House bill is stricter than the proposal passed by the Senate, which would exempt care for minors whose treatment is already underway. The Senate bill would also expire in 4 years. Keith Peters reporting.
Japan's government approving a controversial plan to open the country's first casino in the city of Osaka as it looks to attract more foreign tourists. Past attempts to build casinos have failed, often because of strong public opposition to gambling. SRNnews.com.
Utah Valley and Richfield and Sevier Valley will be clearing to sunny today with a high of 50 and a low tonight of 30. Sunny for the weekend, 58 degrees for a high tomorrow and 70 on Sunday. 50 degrees and mostly sunny today in Price and Castle Valley, 27 for a low tonight. Then sunny, 55 tomorrow, and Sunday will be 62 degrees. Vernal and the Uinta Basin will be mostly cloudy and 44 degrees today. There is a slight chance of afternoon rain or snow showers. Sunny and 49 tomorrow, sunny and 56 on Sunday. Can you walk, run, or roll 5/16 of a mile? Well, then it's time to register for the Key Radio 0.5K, raising money for the Pregnancy Resource Center located in American Fork. The event will be Saturday morning, May 13th. It's always a lot of fun, and we have donuts and coffee at the halfway mark. More information at keyradio.org. This is KEYY Provo, KEYR Richfield, KEYP Price, KEYV Vernal, Key Radio Life Unlocked, Truth Unleashed.
from the Key Radio Studios in Provo, Utah, and broadcasting live throughout Utah County, Sevier County, South Central Utah, Carbon County, and the Uinta Basin. It's your good friends Mike and Heather in the morning.
And happy Day of Silence. Shh. We're still not silent. We have music in the
That
back.
doesn't play well on radio.
It really doesn't. It kind of gets you a little nervous. Actually, silence does get us a little nervous, doesn't it? Like, we need to fill things. You'll notice, like, in a conversation, if someone asks a question, we use filler words like, you know, like we don't like the idea of silence. Jeremy, are you being silent right now? Pastor Jeremy Howard of Orchard Hills Bible Church in Payson, Utah.
There's a Christian song. I think it's actually taken from a Mother Teresa quote, but it's a good song. The way I constructed that sentence maybe is revealing things. The song is titled "Our God is the Friend of Silence." It's a nice little song.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I do like silence, though. I mean,
You married the wrong person,
yes.
Mike.
sometimes I feel it. No, I'm just kidding.
well,
That's awesome.
and today's edition of Live Marriage Counseling.
Yeah, right.
No, once in a while you get like your phone playing music or something, and then you turn it off, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's nice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my point.
No, I agree.
I married the right person. I love this woman.
Oh,
Yeah.
phew.
That's
I was sweating there for a second there. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, but silence is actually a really good thing. And to quiet your soul, right? Be still. All of those things. That's a very godly thing to do. And it's hard to do in a world that is absolutely maddening loud, yelling at you. Like your television, when you're watching something and all of a sudden the advertising come on, come in, do this, do that. And they're yelling at you. You don't even realize they're yelling at you until you turn it off. And like Mike, you said, all of a sudden you get that little bit of rest and you're like, oh, that was really loud.
Yeah. Especially the commercials are so much louder than the TV program. It's like, oh, stop.
Mm-hmm.
Some marketing departments have caught on and have made commercials that are silent because that makes us look up.
Mm-hmm.
Where we're so used to the noise, when there's a commercial that comes on that's just silent with words, we're like, oh, I'm paying attention.
I'm
now.
trying to think of one commercial that's silent with words.
Yeah, I think there was at least one during the Super Bowl.
Okay.
Where it's just like, all the noise from all the commercials, and then boop, it just drops, and then there are words flashing across the screen. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty smart thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it does reflect something about how we're just used to noise, where quietness stands out,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is a strange place to be as a humanity.
Right.
As a humanity.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so let's see. What else in the news? Let me just share with you a couple of things. Friend, I know that if you are in the Highland area, the city is holding a community flood preparation day. That's tomorrow from 9 a.m. to noon, where free sand and sandbags will be available. I think all you have to do is bring a shovel and fill up your own sandbags. I think that's how that works.
Fill your sandbox for the kids.
Yeah, right. Stop.
No kidding. You bring up one of those turtles.
Yeah.
That's not a bag.
It's all right. I'll take care of it later. Now I want to do that. That's really funny. But I know that there are other communities that are doing some things that are very, very similar. In fact, I know that the city of Provo sends out this wonderful newsletter, and it's got some information about flood preparation. Also, just a PSA for you, my friend, we have as a state shakeout, the Utah Shakeout will be held on April 20th. And that it says when 1 million Utahns will participate in earthquake drills at work, school, or home, practicing earthquake safety and other aspects of their emergency plans. For more information, www.shakeout.org/Utah and such like that. So
What are we supposed to do in an earthquake?
you are it's participating is a great way for your family or organization
really.
to be prepared.
What do we do? Like right now, Heather.
I would go under
Things
this
are shaking.
humongous table that you
That would be safe.
That
Yep.
would be like, this thing is not going anywhere. It's reinforced with all sorts of weird reinforcement materials
Yes, steel.
because we have heavy coffee cups. Anyway, but I think it's really important that you do know what to do. Like I remember when I was a kid, we had tornado drills.
Yes, tornado and fire.
Mm-hmm.
No earthquake.
No earthquake where we're from.
Same here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Grant, did you ever have those kinds of things?
No.
No? He didn't bother. He's like, what? Fire? Forget that. I'm not doing it.
You're just gonna die.
No.
That's all there is.
Yeah, I remember having to go in the hallway and put your head between your legs, anyway, just weird stuff like that. Yep. Okay,
Open
enough
the
of that.
windows. I was the opening window guy.
Yep. Okay, that's what you did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, nice.
Fire drills were the best because you got to go stand outside.
Mm-hmm.
Don't open the windows for those.
I remember having it wasn't a fire drill. I think it was like an actual fire alarm, but it was a fake fire alarm, and it was in college, and it was in the middle of the night, and I had to get up, and I'm like, well, I'm going to make pudding. So before I went outside, I grabbed some pudding and some milk and a container, and I just sat there out there shaking because I knew I'd be there a while. I know, it sounds a little weird.
So you were one of the cool kids.
Well, no, I was just hungry. I was just like, no, I don't think cool people make pudding in the middle of the night, but I think that was your point. Thank you.
Oh,
okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're on the same page.
Okay. It's also National Pecan Day, and I think we should all celebrate that because we're a bunch of nuts. But that's
National
enough.
what day?
Pecan, whatever you call it.
Pecan?
Oh, my goodness. I like pecan. It just sounds...
Yeah, no, I say pecan.
Oh, okay. I know we're going to get calls. Hey. Anyway.
Doing what I can to drive traffic to the phone lines.
Thank you. Well, nobody cares. All right. Let's just see here. Mike and I, went over to Orchard Hills Bible Church last Friday, like a week ago.
Yep.
And celebrated Good Friday with your family, your church family. And that was lovely.
Yeah, well, good.
Yeah.
Glad you were there.
Yeah, we were glad too. It was wonderful. And you had food.
There were refreshments.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, Pastor Jeremy, is that like a normal, like if I were to come on a Sunday morning, like your normally scheduled Sunday morning gatherings, is that something similar to what we would expect?
It's similar, but not the same.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you got the elements of singing and looking at the Word of God. You know, that's.
She was talking about the food.
Oh.
No, the whole
Well,
thing. I'm not that
let's
one
break
track.
it down. What was on the menu then?
Yeah. Coffee and cookies, yes.
So no, yeah, I mean, that was a shorter service. It was about 50 minutes. Our regular Sunday morning gathering usually lasts about an hour 20 to an hour and a half, somewhere in there. But the message will be longer. The sermon will be longer on Sunday mornings than at a special service. That was how long did I preach?
I don't know. I wasn't keeping time.
Great.
Yeah. See?
Yeah.
I was listening.
Awesome. That was a test.
Yeah.
And
I passed, Mike. Yay.
I usually preach about 40 to 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Friday night, I think it was probably 20. And we'll sing more songs on a Sunday morning, and there'll be other special announcements or things that we do. Like this past Sunday, Easter Sunday, we had communion. So anyway, but yeah, it'll be relatively similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess I just say that because some of us, we're looking maybe, man, I really want to go to a church gathering to just see what this whole Jesus Bible thing is all about. And a lot of times people will go in and then they're just kind of look like they're deer in headlights, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like I have no idea what to expect. But this is a little bit of what to expect over at Orchard Hills Bible Church if you are in the Payson area. And it's really quite relaxed, right?
Yeah. And expect to be greeted by multiple people,
Mm-hmm.
to be asked what your name is and where you're from, for the lights to be on. We're not a dark church. And, we're not a huge church either. So it's not like really sliding in, sliding out with no one seeing you. And I know there are some people who look for that and think they might experience that with our church.
Mm-hmm.
And when they don't, we don't see them again usually. But if anybody's listening and considering visiting, that's what you can expect. Friendly faces with lights on.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And we have churches that are all over the valley that you could go to if you want to slide in and out, or if you want to be farther away from your home community, so where you don't run into somebody that you don't want to run into or something like that. There's whatever your reason is. Don't let that stop you from going to a church, even if you drive ways for it.
No church is one size fits all.
Yeah,
it's just the reality of it.
Right. It's a family, right? And that's and Mike, I'm also not just Utah Valley, but we're talking Sevier Valley,
sure.
we're talking Castle Valley, we're talking the Uinta Basin, even Salt Lake Valley. And so, friends, we just really want you to encounter Jesus. That's the whole point. And a good Bible-believing, Christ-focused church is going to do just that. So, and we just have great confidence in Orchard Hills just because, we've been there, we've seen it, and we just love the church family there. And by the way, you can also hear Jeremy's sermons on Key Radio in the weekend. And I can't remember what day of the week as well.
Saturdays and Sundays.
Yes, but then also one time during the weekday.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That'd be news to
I
me.
have to, you know what I could do? No, it's not news to you. I've told you that, so I've got
Well, I'll go
emails
look
to
it up
prove
on
it.
the internet.
You
Yes.
look it up for
For
me.
I do read the
Yeah.
memos.
That's how important I am. But let's get started. Friend, I also want to remind you that this is a conversation, and if you want to make a suggestion or make a comment or what have you, or an observation, or you just want to say, hi ho, neighbor, we'd love to hear from you. And you could do that a couple different ways. You could text us, 855-539-4583. That's 855 Key Glue. We are also on Facebook Live and YouTube Live, by the way. Thank you to Grant Burkhalter, who is sitting there so nicely and faithfully at those
Tuesday.
controls. Tuesdays at 10:30.
10:30.
Okay, Tuesdays at 10:30. But you can also put a comment in the comment section on Facebook as well. So just a number of different ways that you can communicate with us. And if later, by the way, if you're like, okay, I was just listening and something just kind of came up in my brain and I have a follow-up question, you can always email us, mail@keyradio.org, or come on down, have a talk with us. We're in Provo. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Spiritual
Yeah.
amnesia. That's what we are talking about this series. And I'll tell you what, this has been a stretch for me. I've had to do a lot of studying, but fruitful studying. And that is not a pun. I didn't intend it, but we are going to be talking about the Feast of First Fruits today. But the whole idea is human beings, as a rule, are very forgetful. And so that means that maybe in the Christian's context, God has been faithful through and through, throughout all the millennia, since forever. And yet when we are faced with trials or tribulations or questions or whatever, a lot of times we'll forget the faithfulness of God and that he fulfills all of his promises. He is a promise-making God, sure, but he's a promise keeper. And we've seen that time and time and time and time again throughout Scripture. But God is really sweet to us. He is so gracious. And in the Old Testament, looking at Leviticus specifically, we're seeing that he instituted a number of feasts for the Jewish people. There's 7 of them. And 4 of them are in the springtime, which is very interesting. And the idea wasn't that, hey, I'm just going to make you do these things. It was actually a celebration. This was to reflect on the goodness of God and the fact that, you know what, he has proven himself time and time again. And he didn't have to, by the way. He's God. He doesn't have to prove himself to us. But yet, in his tenderness, he has shown us that he does fulfill all his promises. And we're going to be taking a look at that. We talked about remembering that we forget. We talked about the Passover on Wednesday. We talked about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was a really interesting conversation yesterday. And today, I've entitled this, Eat Your Fruit and Veggies. But really, it's just, we're talking about, I was trying to be funny. It's not that funny. Thank you very much for the pity laugh. But it's really coming down to the Feast of First Fruits. And again, we look back into Leviticus 23. And starting in verse 9 is where we're seeing the Feast of First Fruits and how that all plays out. But I wanted to, the springboard verse is actually Colossians 2:13-14, where it says, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." And you're like, what does that have to do with anything? Oh, I'm glad we're going to talk about this, right? Friend, let's begin this first fruits thing, okay? What is the, let's review, what is the whole purpose for at least the feasts?
Wow. Well, that's kind of a complicated answer that I could give.
Okay.
Because there are multiple purposes. God can walk and chew gum at the same time, which is cool. And so, I mean, it's kind of like what's the purpose of the giving of the law, generally? Because we do well to recognize that these feasts are given within the law. Okay, so there's actually a bigger question, like why was the law given? And you do have, of course, on the one hand, God was setting his people apart, and you see that in the feasts. These were particular feasts for a particular people during a particular time that set them apart as a nation from all the other nations. That's true. Though there's something else going on, like with the law, over and over again, Israel was failing. Over and over again, Israel was having to make offerings and sacrifices. And we learn, as we continue reading the narrative of the Bible, that all of that was foreshadowing the one who was to come to fulfill those things.
Mm-hmm.
So even though Israel wasn't in the know like we are now in the know on this side of the cross, they were participating in something where it was actually like a shadow and not the substance.
Mm-hmm.
So the feasts fall into that, as do so many things within the law, where it's like God was giving these things to this people, not just to set them apart at that time, at the present time for them, but to build up to the apex of the story, which is the coming of the Messiah, who fulfills the law on our behalf, and that includes the feasts. So kind of an interesting thing. There are multiple things at play here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it's really important to note that the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits, they're all celebrated basically within the same week.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not originally how it happened, because when the first feasts were initiated by the Lord, it was the Passover and it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? Because we remember the narrative where they were supposed to get rid of all the yeast in their home and then just and then be ready to run, right? Because the destroying angel was going to come and Pharaoh was going to say, hey, get out of here. I don't want to look at you. And he was just very upset. So these people knew that they had to run because God told them. So there's a lot of that reflection in these feasts. But the feast for the first fruits was not going to be revealed or celebrated, excuse me, until they got to the Promised Land.
Yes, correct. And the feast of first fruits actually is within Passover, which is interesting. So there's like a multi-layer thing going on in all kinds of respects as we examine what this feast of first fruits is. So it's after Passover has begun. Now, within that, you have the Feast of First Fruits, and it was for when they got to the Promised Land, because it had to do with the blessing God was going to bestow on the nation that was agricultural,
mm-hmm.
where they would have fruits to give. So it had to do when they got to this land that God was giving them and the blessing that he was going to bring as they were in that land.
Mm-hmm. I am really, like, this whole ag thing, agrarian, is that the word?
Pastoral.
This whole thing is pretty interesting because God is using everyday life as a way to show his goodness and to show his promises and to help them to reflect on what's to come.
And what's amazing is that it's not just at that time he was going to do that. I mean, and that was part of the blessing that came from keeping the law.
Mm-hmm.
You will be blessed if you keep the law. God says this is Deuteronomy 27-29. And all these blessings are going to come. And there are a lot of agricultural things. And then if you disobey the law, here are all the curses. And there are a lot of agricultural things. And there's more stuff mixed in. And part of the promise of the law, by the way, that Moses gave was when you fail and you get cursed and you're scattered, But as you keep reading the Old Testament narrative, when you get especially into the minor prophets, but also in the major prophets, you get these promises of Israel once again returning to their land, settling in their land. Ezekiel talks about dividing the land again among the 12 tribes. And all these agricultural promises are going to come to fruition, no pun intended, or was it?
Yeah.
And so in the end, God is going to bring it all full circle, prove himself ultimately kind and faithful to this nation, and give them those agricultural blessings in the end. So that's actually a day we're still looking forward to.
Mm-hmm.
The first fruits isn't a word that we use commonly today.
No.
Is it just what it means, like the first of the harvest? Is that?
It is, yeah. And what's actually particularly interesting about the Feast of First Fruits is it was one of 3 feasts where first fruits were given. So if you look at the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Weeks, you have in those feasts the first of like olives being given. I think it was with Tabernacles, and the first of grain, the wheat being given with, I believe, the weeks. Well, in the Feast of First Fruits, it's the first of the barley. Barley was the first fruits of all the fruits, okay? When we say fruit, we're not talking papayas and mangoes here,
Right.
We're talking about things that grow out of the ground. And so as they see the fruit of their harvest in the very first thing that would come up, the barley, they were to take that and then give it to the Lord, just showing that they're totally relying on Him for all that they have, all the things that He provides. They're giving back to Him with the first, and they're blessing Him as He has blessed them.
When I think of the let's say grapes on a vine or something, it's like you see them, you've been waiting for them, you want to eat those.
Oh, yeah.
And here the idea is you're giving them back to the Lord.
Well, it's a real penetrating acknowledgement of, I didn't make this happen, right? Because we do want like that. We've been at work, we've been pruning or whatever, if it's grapevines, we've been doing what we're supposed to do to help things come out of the ground. It's not like we're totally hands off. But at the same time, no matter how hard a farmer works, he cannot make that seed do anything. And anybody who's tried to grow stuff knows this, right? Like, you look up all the books, all the little tricks, you go to the YouTube videos, you try everything, and you have the perfect pH of the soil, and you give it the perfect amount of sunlight and the perfect amount of water. But ultimately, God is the one responsible. And it's the same with bearing children. I mean, let's just be honest, right? I mean, people who, when they're ready to have children, a couple's ready, they do all the things. They read all the books. They do all the tricks. But it's up to God to open the womb. And so it's an acknowledgement of, not to my name, but to yours be the glory, even by giving a sacrifice of the first fruits.
I think this is so striking, too, because when I first read this, a long time ago, right, I see first fruits, and I think literally like fruit, like the apple and the whatever, and the papaya, which you mentioned, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, all that stuff, right, that it comes after, like in the fall, right, but this is something different. Like you said, this is the barley, so this is actually like really the first thing that's coming out of the ground. So let's set the stage a little bit.
And you guys are from Wisconsin, so you know all about barley.
I know nothing.
What kind of drinks it makes.
Yeah, right. But I've never grown it, right? And I've never been like a wheat farmer or anything. So this is very different for me. So there's a lot of learning that has to be. But see, what you're seeing is there's a winter, right? And there's nothing. Everything's dead, right? Everything is resting. There's nothing going on. And then you come up to the point where it's now springtime. And make no mistake, there's a reason, I think, why the first fruits and why the feasts are where they're at, and the whole part about how we have different seasons. I think the Lord is using that, what He's already instituted, and showing His goodness. And there's a lot of symbolism here. So there's a lot of deadness in the winter. Then in the spring, what do you see? I'm probably playing my hand here, showing my hand, but there's Easter, right? And that falls at a specific time. And notice that the first fruits fall at that same time. And so you're like, how can this be where they have to celebrate first fruits like the Sunday after Easter? And that's really what it is. It's a Sunday after Passover. Why did they celebrate it then? Well, it's because the whole earth is getting into the springtime. There's a season. And so you can expect to see this barley harvest. That is tremendous to me. Like it's scheduled, even though you're like, is it going to grow? Is it going to grow? Is there going to be barley? And then there is. And I think that's just reflecting the promises of God. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, God is doing something at a meta level here when He's giving Israel His law with these feasts and the sacrifices and all kinds of stuff, where He's tying together one big story, and they get to participate and see part of it, but not all of it. And aren't we thankful we are on this end of history where we can look back and see what God was doing in His program to build up to a certain moment where the Christ would come and be magnified and be the fulfillment of these things in ways that they couldn't necessarily anticipate.
So in Leviticus 23, and starting in verse 9, we see, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land," I love it, it's when you come, okay? "When you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." So notice this is going to be it would be after the Sabbath, right? So if we remember, the Sabbath is on a Saturday, and the first fruits are waved on a Sunday. I get a little excited here because I'm starting to see. And let me go on. "And on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb a year old without blemish as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the grain offering with it shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to the Lord with a pleasing aroma, and the drink offering with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. So what we're seeing here is there is definitely an offering to the Lord, but all of it is it's the day after the Sabbath, so on a Sunday, and it's the perfect. Everything is perfect, offered to the Lord. It's beautiful. It's fine flour, no blemishes. Everything's beautiful. Now, I want to fast forward, if I can, because now what we're seeing is we finished looking at Easter, right, as Christians here. And this is the reason why I say, why should this be important to the Christian? And I see the symbolism here reflecting what Jesus has done. And I want to fly right into that because I think this is exciting stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can overdo it when it comes to symbolism really easily. That's always a danger. And that begins with going farther than the Bible goes.
Right.
Okay. However, we can also just appreciate the beauty and goodness of God. I mean, I think there's even something to going from winter into spring. I mean, does the Bible go into detail about the seasons reflecting what God is doing in the world on his calendar? No, but can we acknowledge that there's a deadness of winter and there's a coming to life in spring and that these feasts happen in spring? Yeah, I think we can. I think that's a beautiful thing. In fact, I would plug, there's a Christian artist named Chris Renzema, and he's got an album, says something with B-sides is the title. But basically there are 5 short songs on there. It's a little EP. And he's basically just sharing about this whole idea of going from winter to spring, how God's love is like springtime. And death is dead and gone with the winter is one of the things he says in the song. So I think there's something to that, but we just have to be a little hesitant about going too far.
Right. And I think that's a good warning or caution for all of us, right? But can I read? I want to read 1 Corinthians 15.
Not until
I read
1 Corinthians 5:7.
Okay, all right.
Because this is important. Yeah, I think I know where you're going.
Okay, all right.
Now, if I don't know where you're going, then I just totally threw you off for no reason.
That's all right. This is a conversation.
I think, were you going to be talking about the first fruits that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15? Okay, well, we do well to remember, like I mentioned earlier, the first fruits, that feast is within Passover. Passover came first, right? And so 1 Corinthians 5:7. Let's check that one out.
Okay. Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed.
All right.
Okay.
So thinking about the Passover, central to the Passover was this idea, especially when you think of the original story in Exodus 12, I believe it is, where they had to take a lamb without spot, without blemish, and they had to sacrifice that lamb, and they had to put blood on the doorpost, and they would be passed over, and they wouldn't die. Well, here, Paul is saying that Christ, in his death, is our Passover lamb, and there's even a connection to the unleavened stuff, getting the leaven out of the house. So we first have to have this understanding that Christ is the ultimate Passover lamb. He's the fulfillment of Passover. Well, shortly after Passover, within this Passover celebration in Judaism, was the Feast of First Fruits. So the natural question is, does Christ fulfill that also? And I think that's where you were going to go in 15.
Yeah. So, I'm not on 15 where I want to be, but 1 Corinthians 15, probably in 20. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
All right.
Okay.
So here we have that word being used. It's a Hebrew Old Testament word in connection to that feast. Christ, in his resurrection, is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So there's a connection, a shadow and substance relationship, a type and fulfillment relationship between that feast and what Christ has done. And we know, of course, this idea of first fruits, you have the word first in it, meaning there are other fruits to follow. And so Christ is the first fruits from the dead. He's the first one to be raised in immortality, never to die again. And the hope that we have as Christians is that we will be with him in the likeness of his resurrection. We are the fruit that follows. So it's an amazing picture that God's putting together here.
Absolutely. Do you, I mean, and I see that if you were just a student of the New Testament, okay, and you're going through 1 Corinthians 15, and even 1 Corinthians, just all of it, you could get the same gist of what is going on, and that, that Jesus is the Passover lamb. You would figure that out. The first fruits you can kind of understand. But doesn't that give you a depth of understanding by going back to Leviticus 23 and saying, oh, I'm seeing where this is all pointing to? Now, Jeremy, I mean, I've heard it said that the Old Testament is pointing, everything in Scripture points to Jesus. Is that an accurate statement?
Depending on what exactly is meant by that.
Okay.
So, for instance, Song of Solomon, is that pointing to Jesus? Now things get awkward,
yeah,
right?
Right.
And some people will make that argument. Some people will go in there and see that romantic relationship that Solomon was having with his wife, he was very excited about, and say, this is all about, every verse in here is about Jesus and the church, actually. Well, that takes you to some weird places in a hurry, okay? And yeah, you can read through Old Testament narrative and encounter several things like that. Now, generally speaking, everything in the Bible, will it ultimately be fulfilled in Christ? Yes. Yes. All things that God has promised, are they going to find their fulfillment outside of Christ? Any of those things God has promised? No, they're not. Christ has become our covenant from God. That's the way Isaiah speaks about the coming Messiah. He has become to us God's covenant. And he initiates the new covenant in his blood. And in the new covenant, all things are going to be fulfilled. So it's this amazing reality that Jesus is central to the story, and this covenant that he's initiating, this new covenant that has been inaugurated, is where there's going to be fulfillment of all things. But does that mean every single verse is talking about Jesus? No. However, there are certainly lots of verses in the Old Testament that are talking about Jesus that prophesy him in one way or another, and those feasts are a great example of that.
Wonderful.
Heather brought up the 1 Corinthians, and we can go there and we could see the reference of when the use of the first fruits. What's our exegetical practice in maintaining integrity with having a proper shadows and pictures?
Yeah, where's the line, basically, on how far we can go in seeing Christ hidden in the Old Testament? That is a place where we're going, like pretty much all Christians are going to land in some different spots on that. There are some people who will say, unless the New Testament explicitly addresses it, I'm not going to claim it. Now, that can be pretty limiting. It's safe, that's for sure. It's high on the safe meter, but it's also high on the limiting meter, okay? So how far you bring down those meters, that's just something you're going to have to work out. Now, there's Christian freedom in that, but there's also a line that can be crossed where you can start saying things that are basically borderline heretical. I mean, if you want to see Jesus in every single verse of the Old Testament, that will lead you into some very bad places. So we have to be careful.
I think when we get into that, there's also a very real danger of missing the point of the passage. When you're reading in, like, oh, this is all imagery, it's all spiritualized, it's all a picture, we tend to lose. No, first and foremost, the author is talking about this. We can tell by the context of what is being said and what is actually, like, physically what they are talking about is not this picture, although the picture can still exist. If we just try to read in the imagery into everything, it's the whole idiom of missing the forest for the trees.
That is exactly right. That's an excellent point, because what ends up happening is people get motivated to read their Old Testament by finding Jesus in every verse, and by definition, you're ignoring the context in which it was originally given. And so a good rule of thumb would be read the Bible in context no matter where you are in the Bible. So if you're going back and reading about these feasts, you kind of have to put yourself in that mindset of someone living over 1,000 years before Christ, and what God had revealed to them at that point, what they understood. You have to grasp that first. And then after that, if you want to see how that plays with the rest of the storyline that we have, then totally do that.
Mm-hmm.
But first establish context. I mean, like Grant was saying, if you're motivated by, well, forget all that context. We know the end of the story. Let's jam the end of the story into everything that comes before it. You're actually abusing the revelation God's given us by ignoring the context.
So context, context, context.
That's it.
I think there are some general principles, though, going back to the tree thing, that we can apply to all of these. And number one, we have the advantage of seeing in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus indeed is the first fruit. So that is our advantage, especially when dealing with this particular feast. But here's some requirements. You had to have your first fruits, right? They had to be good. It wasn't, you couldn't have like wilty, sad, shrivelly fruit when you brought it to the Lord, right? I mean, so there's that.
There had to be sacrifice.
Yeah. That's just it, right? And love requires sacrifice.
Yeah.
I mean, so we have to understand that this wasn't something where they were told this is what you do, but your heart needs to be, look what the Lord has done. And human beings have a tendency to say, oh, I got another requirement, and missing the whole point, right? And I think that's what Israel was doing, and why they actually, that you see in other parts of Scripture where they were just really not liking the whole idea of offering, or just they were put off by it, right? They forgot the reason why they were doing it in the first place, which is kind of funny because the reason why it was instituted is so they wouldn't forget, right?
Yeah, well, isn't that so similar to how Christians treat Sunday church today?
Yes.
I mean, it's just, in heaven, we'll look back and think, what were we doing, being grumpy on the way to church, forgetting what this majestic fellowship coming to the heavenly Mount Zion was all about. I mean, we're so fallen.
Yeah, we really are.
And there's an application today for giving too, isn't there? You can,
Yes. Yeah. For space giving, not forgiving, one word,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm like, what's space giving?
It's this thing Elon Musk is working with. Yes. When we give, we are to give our best as cheerful givers, and not give last with whatever's left. I mean, it's kind of like approaching life. Well, after you try all things, then you can pray. We pray first, okay? After you spend all your money, whatever's left, then you can give. No, we give first. That should be our attitude, is to give God our best of what we have, because it all comes from Him. And that's going to look different from everybody. We are under no tithing laws or anything like that. That'll look different, okay? But we should have that perspective of, I want to honor God by giving Him my best and sacrificing for Him. He gave His only begotten Son. And so there is application and that carries across that we are to give, and we are to do so in hope. I mean, this is an illustration that Paul uses in the New Testament. The farmer sows in hope for a harvest. And so we give in hope. Even the way Paul talks about the resurrection of Christ. He's the first fruits. There's hope that we have this resurrection like Christ. And it's not only to Christ's resurrection where he makes that connection with first fruits. It's also with his converts. At the end of Romans, in Romans 16, he lists off some names and he says they're the first fruits of converts in Greece. He had hope there'd be more to follow. They were just the first. There will be more to follow. And so when we sacrificially give, we're not doing so thinking, man, we're just making ourselves poor. This is stupid. No, we're giving, and we're giving in hope, knowing that God's our provider. He's the one who gave us this in the first place. He'll continue to provide, and I want to give for God, whether that's money, whether that's time, whether it's whatever, all the above. You give your best to honor God, trusting Him.
Mm-hmm. I just don't even know where to begin, but I think I wanted to always start with Jesus. God is so merciful to us, and we do not deserve it, number one, right? You and I, friend, we are wretched sinners, wicked through and through. And yet the Lord has been so generous and so gracious to us, giving us a sure hope that we could have our sins forgiven, our wickedness, our evil ways forgiven. But He did that at the cost of Himself, true sacrifice. And that's, I think, where we get that true love. You have it requires sacrifice. And that's what God had demonstrated. It wasn't like God is saying, this is what you need to do, and then He doesn't do it. He's the first one who did it. He's the one who sacrificed everything so that Jesus paid our sin debt in full. He paid it all, right? And so God didn't say, I'm going to give you a weak, sad, flawed way of being saved. He gave us the perfect, sufficient way to be saved.
Yeah.
Can you comment more on that?
Oh, man. Yeah. There's so much to say. I mean, God, when I talked earlier about he can walk and chew gum at the same time, not only was he setting his nation apart, Israel, through these feasts and sacrifices, not only was he foreshadowing, like, as a cool thing to do, in a story, like maybe some people are film buffs or whatever, and they can catch on to things in a movie where they're foreshadowing, and that's just a really cool thing that directors and producers can put into movies. And he was doing that. Those are things that he was doing. It's very cool. But he was also communicating to them their total insufficiency to remedy their condition. Mm-hmm. He was communicating to them the depth of their sin problem. Even with something like this Feast of First Fruits, it's called a feast, and first fruits, it's a happy word. Mm-hmm. That's a good word, And you're bringing a sheaf of barley, and we're waving it around. Hey, this is cool, But even in that, they're having to sacrifice animals that we read about. Mm-hmm. They're having to kill animals still, all over and over and over again with different ceremonies, not the least of which was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. They're having to sacrifice animals, kill animals. And God is communicating the depth of their sin problem. And the fact that the priests would have to do this annually, perpetually, was communicating something about the depth of the problem. When one priest dies, another takes his place, and we just keep doing these rituals. We keep doing these ceremonies, all leading up to the time where we have a perfect and final high priest and a perfect and final sacrifice. And that is just another point of emphasis on Jesus in the story, that Jesus comes along as the mediator of his own offering, and the offering is of himself. And he's a better mediator, he's a better priest, he's a better offering, he's a better sacrifice, offering salvation once for all, that he would never have to be sacrificed again, but he's the final sacrifice. He's the final priest. I mean, these are amazing fulfillments that he offers us, and now that allows us in this dispensation or this era of the church, it allows us to live in freedom where we're not under the law like that anymore, but we're now free to worship. We're free to come directly to God in Jesus Christ because he has satisfied all that was required to take care of sin. And